Yeah, so my name's Eric Sorenson. I am the product manager for Puppet, and before that I was a systems administrator doing a lot of work in configuration management. I've been doing configuration management since before there was a Puppet. I started out doing CF Engine back when that was the new hotness, and eventually shifted over into the Puppet world for a few years, and then eventually liked working with it so much I started working on it. So this is my Twitter handle and my email address. It's a Danish O with a slash through it, but I wanted to indicate that was a 0. My IRC nick, if you're on the Puppet IRC channel, is also Eric0. Eric was already taken, so I just made it so that it was a 0 indexed array, and the rest is history. I'd like to give a couple of shout outs. This is a great time to pull out your mobile phones. This is the only time during the day when I'm going to ask you to take out your phones and look at them. It's both to give a shout out to HubC on Twitter, which is the Twitter handle of the hub here, and use the hashtag HubCamp if you want to. It's kind of a neat back channel throughout the day. We'll be looking at it and replying to tweets, and if you have questions or want to get at the speakers, it's a pretty good way to do it. There's also a great time now that you have your phone out to make sure that it's muted so that your meeting reminders don't remind everybody else that you have a meeting that you're not at. And then you can put your phone back away. So I'd like to start off with a quick poll. Can you raise your hand if you're using Puppet right now? Not right now, but in general right now. Cool, that's great. Is there anybody who's new to Puppet? That is, this camp is kind of your first exposure to Puppet. That is awesome too. Welcome. That's about almost 25% of the crew here, which is great to see. Welcome. How about raise your hand if you are primarily on the operations systems administration side? How about primarily on the developer side of the house? How about if you're one of the fabled DevOps engineers that does both things equally? That's amazing. You are in a good world right now. Is there anybody here who's using another automation tool in your job that's not Puppet? That's cool. Excellent. Yeah, there's lots of Puppet in conjunction with other things. Are you using an automation tool that you wrote yourself? Your company wrote? It's okay, life gets better, it's fine. Is there anybody who's not using any automation whatsoever to get through your day-to-day life and well, okay, so, it's okay, you don't have to be embarrassed to raise your hand. I would just encourage you that life gets better for you as well. But because being a sysadmin is really tough, it's a difficult life. There's a lot of balls in the air. It can often feel very. I'm getting a little ring off of the mic. Could you turn it down just a notch? Thanks. It can often feel difficult and thankless. I read a study that said that the average systems administrator gets interrupted about once every 15 minutes. And there's another study that said that after you get any kind of interruption, if you're trying to do technical work, it takes about a half an hour to get back to the place you were before. So if you do the math, you figure out you're actually, it's a very rare time in your day when you're able to get to, you wish for 15 minutes?
Yeah, so really only able to do about 15 minutes of actual work.
Yeah, it's tough. There's a little grace period if you show up at 7:30 in the morning, or if you stay until 7 o'clock at night. But generally speaking, a lot of the day, both on the sysadmin and developer side, particularly for folks that are really running at high velocity environments, you have continual pressure to do more, go faster, spend less money, get more done, and make fewer errors. And this is kind of where the state of IT automation comes in. It's now more critical than ever. It used to be that you could, when I started out, we had a couple of servers, and it's no big deal if it's very rare that you would have to go through a lot of time to do configuration management to bring up another server. It would take like a few weeks probably just to get the power plugged in, and a couple more weeks to get the operating system installed. And so the idea that you would have to capture and recreate configuration off of that server in a very high velocity, dozens of servers a day sort of speed was pretty unheard of. But things are obviously changing, and there's no future that we can think of now that has fewer servers than what we have today. Fewer systems, less software, fewer problems to solve in the space of infrastructure. Things are just getting more and more complex, and even if you, there was an interesting exchange between Luke Knees, who started Puppet, and Mitchell Hashimoto, who is writing a lot of infrastructure automation tools at HashiCorp, like Vagrant and Atlas and Console. Luke said there's no future with fewer servers, and Mitchell replied, well, there's fewer servers that I run. A lot of the servers are going to, I may use services that are software as a service that I used to run internally, but are now run by somebody else. And Luke replied, well, your SaaS is somebody else's data center, right? There's somebody that's running that service, and even if it's externalized to your business as a core, somebody else is also having to provide availability uptimes, scale out, and SLAs to you so that you can rely on that service instead of having to run it yourself. There were a lot of big companies in the late 90s and early 2000s that decided that their IT operations weren't strategic to their business and decided to outsource them. And if anybody has worked with services that got outsourced and then got brought back in after the outsourcing didn't work out so well, the trend is sort of starting to reverse itself. And now it's like the companies are realizing that that being good at IT is actually a competitive advantage. That if you can drive your own costs down, you can deliver services faster, you can have higher uptime, you'll be able to take customers away from other folks, even if it's not a core part of your business, right? Even if it's not a web store where you have a buy rate that has to stay at a particular level in order to maintain the cash flow coming in, if you don't do your IT with a high degree of precision, velocity, and responsiveness to your customers, your competitor will, and take away that competitive advantage from you. So it turns out that even if so regardless of what you're doing, your technology has to be faster and more focused on delivering value to the business. I feel like there's about 4 sort of axes to think about this on. One of them is speed, just raw time to market. How quickly can we get new change out to it, whether that's a new feature that needs to get out to the website, or delivering a new data center to provide service in a new geographic region. You have to have speed without agility. Doesn't really work. You have to be able to course correct when it's wrong. So agility is also really important. Focus is a key element. Like it's I don't know if anybody's read Jim Collins' book Good to Great, but it's a great sort of business-oriented book. It has this concept of hedgehog companies that do one thing and do it really well. And if you can figure out what your one thing is as an organization and iterate on that, get really, really good at providing competitive advantage for your company, then that's the benefit of having focus. And the other thing is alignment with what your customers are doing. If you can do all those things, but nobody cares about it because it's not solving a problem that they have, then they're ultimately going to be a super high-performing, totally irrelevant company. So all of that is a sort of IT overall. Things in the past couple of years are changing pretty rapidly too. We have a bunch of new buzzwords as well as new paradigms that people are running under. We have to deal with cloud things. This is one of those terms that used to mean something and became so overloaded now that it's hard to even make sense of what somebody means when they say cloud. I saw a TV ad a few weeks ago for your home cloud, and I had to I was like, it was just weird enough that I had to go and look up what it was. It turns out it's like a hard drive with a Wi-Fi adapter on it. And that's your home cloud. There you go. You're done. So it maybe doesn't mean anything anymore. But there actually are 2 really important things that trends that are coming out of the overall like cloud computing stuff that are not just a hard drive with a Wi-Fi adapter. One of them is this concept of SaaS and using other people's data center and services for stuff that's not strategic to your business. So a great example of this is mail servers. Does anybody still run your own mail server for your organization? couple of folks. I bet about 10 years ago it would have been 5 times as many people here, right? That's one of those things that has really been driven towards, if it's not Google Apps and everybody running Gmail, it's probably live, Windows Live or Office 365. Sorry, I'm not so hip on the Microsoft-centric email service, but we use Gmail and Puppet, and I have had to edit a postfix configuration in the last 3 or 4 years, but it was entirely voluntary. It wasn't because it was my job. But that's one of those areas where it used to be, everybody had a bespoke SendMail set up, ran their IMAP in-house, and then over time Gmail was proved that they were so much better at it than everybody else. And it turned out that actually having an email service is not really a great way to spend 2 or 3 full-time systems administrators, right? They could be delivering value to the business instead of just running IT stuff. So that allows you to focus on what your business is actually doing. The other one is sort of the more infrastructure as a service, where if you have an organization that's providing central IT services and you want to allow developers to get to the point where they can spin up a development environment to test code in something that looks very much like production, so you don't have hey, we just pushed something wrong, everything broke. But it worked on my laptop. Why did it break in production? Well, production doesn't look anything like the laptop. Well, if you have either a VMware setup, an OpenStack setup, there's a lot of homegrown kind of infrastructure as a service setups that people are working towards that allow you to give the power to spin up a very production-looking environment to anybody who needs to do that. That allows a much greater sense of confidence and reliability in changes that are going out to the rest of the world. So, and those are. Somebody didn't follow my advice. The next kind of big trend that we're seeing is a lot of containerization and what is, I think, somewhat erroneously referred to as immutable infrastructure. It's kind of the label that has been attached to it, and this is stuff like Docker is a great example, where if you can encapsulate what it is that makes up your application into a very lightweight container, it allows you to distribute that application and spin up a bunch of instances, start them up very quickly, manage change as it rolls out inside the container, so you're not making changes to live systems. Probably a better word for this, I would say, would be disposable infrastructure, because it's not that the stuff is actually immutable. You can log into a Docker instance and change things just like you can logging into a VM or actual bare metal system. It's just that the changes are sort of irrelevant. They're disposable. The life cycle of those containers is much shorter, and it's okay to toss them and start over rather than try to manage state over time. But it turns out that you just because you can build the image and distribute the image, it doesn't actually remove the need for configuration management overall, because now you have a proliferation of individual images, and you still have to manage what they are, what the contents are, where they are, and how change rolls through your images, even if as a related problem to change rolling through live systems. So it just moves the point at which you need your configuration management from runtime on the systems to build time. And so I have a couple of examples of how Puppet is working with Docker specifically, but containers in general. So the upshot of this is that your IT performance matters now more than ever. We have a report called the State of DevOps report that Puppet Labs sponsors, and that the result we have tons of respondents. I think there were I have the exact number here, but something like 10,000 respondents from all across all industries, and people were talking about how what their day-to-day lives are like, how the changes that I just described are affecting their lives. And it allowed the researchers to draw conclusions draw lines between the profitability and market share of the companies that the respondents came from and how high-performing their IT infrastructure was. And it turns out that if you have high-performing IT, you're actually more likely to have a successful business. you're 2 times more likely to get to profitability and 50% higher market cap growth over 3 years. So these are sort of the big data long-term trends that came out of having this huge set of respondents to the survey. DevOps, which a few years ago was just kind of like again, one of those sort of buzzwords that nobody really knew what it necessarily meant, is now actually really a large enterprise thing. There are now people who will, I think, erroneously sell you DevOps software, which is not right. It's a cultural change that we need to imbue throughout our organizations, not something that you can buy off the shelf and install and then, oh, hey, all of a sudden you got a DevOps. And certainly there's a lot of people that are doing it wrong. I think you'll see this, one of the more amusing trends is the institutionalization of a DevOps team that's now a new silo in between development and operations. It's like, excuse me, you're doing it wrong. We're all supposed to work together and bring some of the practices that developers have been working on for decades, such as continuous delivery, test-driven development, into the practice of operations, and conversely bringing stuff that from the operations world, like monitoring everything, owning your availability, bring those over into the development world, so it's not a throw the code over the wall and see what happens when it hits production. The people that wrote the code are actually on the hook and are involved in the actual running of the service that they helped write. So this is this report is really interesting. You can get it on our website. It has both the raw data as well as it has some interesting sort of conceptual things that can help you convince your organization that DevOps matters. If you're running into barriers organizationally for change and people not wanting to adopt new methodologies or new practices, there's some pretty charts and graphs that managers like to see, and some language that can help push that organizational change through. I believe also, I haven't spoken with her about it, but I believe Catherine Harrell's talk this afternoon is also about building these bridges from across your organization and helping that out. Let's see just a second. So at Puppet Labs, we also started this campaign about change agents of IT operations, and this was a series of interviews that we did with customers. There's a bunch of really pretty awesome videos that are up on the website that talk about people that have gone through this kind of transformation in their organization from either a really slow-moving, kind of high-bound traditional organization where they had a lot of very slow time to deliver services to their customers. They started applying DevOps practices. I'm not saying that they, again, bought Puppet and that changed their organization. It takes a lot of hard work and a lot of human interaction. But through the adoption of these practices, they were able to speed up and their rates of change and deliver more value more quickly. Getty Images, who are here in Seattle, it has a great video up, and Heartland Payment Systems also talks about going from months down to hours, weeks down to minutes for that sort of self-service deployment that I was talking about earlier. So where does Puppet fit into all of this? I mean, like I said, it's not a product that you can buy off the shelf and install it and automatically have a DevOps. But you do need some things in place in order to enable that organizational transformation to happen. And automation is a huge part of that. John Willis and Damon Edwards, when they started off the DevOps Days series of talks and conferences, kind of hit upon these 4 tenets of culture, automation, monitoring, and sharing. And the automation piece is obviously where Puppet's going to fit in closely, and as well as sharing. You're going to have to do the culture part yourself. But we really want to make it so that you can have increased speed, increased productivity, and better insight, kind of tying into that monitoring aspect of it. What does that mean specifically? There's a bunch of stuff that you can do with Puppet. Right? You can take all kinds of system primitives, different kinds of resources in Puppet's lingo that are on your system, and start managing them instead of not managing them at all, manage them by hand or managing them by either your homegrown system or through shell scripts or whatever. You can use Puppet's language to start managing and modifying those. And this isn't just sort of the baseline stuff that's on a computer system, whether a Windows or a Unix-based system, like the stuff on the left-hand side of the screen there. Also, the Puppet language is extensible enough, and the module ecosystem is rich enough that people have developed modules to manage, network and storage devices, full application stacks. Like OpenStack is a great example. It's one of the most, in my opinion, fiendishly complicated distributed systems ever designed by humans. But there's a fantastic series of Puppet modules that allow you to manage that complexity and wrangle it instead of having to know all the guts and the ins and outs of each of the 75 or 80 different OpenStack components. I'm exaggerating, but perhaps only slightly. You can just use the Puppet module and manage a whole OpenStack infrastructure. What's consistent about them is the Puppet approach. So the way it works is that you define what the desired state is that you want, and Puppet will figure out how to make that state a reality, determine what's different between what you've said, what you've declared in the Puppet modules, and what the actual running state is on the system, and try to bring the running state in line with what you've said. So rather than go through and run a script top to bottom, build a model about what the state is that you as the administrator have said that things need to look like. In this little code snippet in the center, we've said that you make sure that SSH is running, and we need to enable it so that when the system restarts, SSH will come up. And then based on what operating system you're running, whether that's through systemd or System 5 NetScripts or Windows services, query the current system state. Is SSH actually running? If it's not, let me remedy that and bring it up through the mechanisms that the system provides to do that. Does that make sense? That's kind of the core of the Puppet. Just wanted to make sure. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, and we'll talk about how that works in with larger workflows. But that whole concept of defining your state and then testing the current system state and remedying it if we can is really the guts of what we're doing here. Once you've defined your state, you can do a test approach. I'm not sure if this is so define, test, enforce, and report is the 4 stages here, and that contrast is not super great on the screen there, but that's what we're talking about. So now we can test them out. I'm sorry? Your rapport. It's the culture part. We're building rapport. No, wait. That's reports. You can do a test flight, simulate what would happen if you were to apply them, and then actually enforce them. Since what I mentioned a minute ago, you want to bring if there's someone has gone on and manually stopped SSH from running or disabled it, Puppet would detect that and remedy it, and then send you a report that says, hey, I've detected that this change had happened and I've fixed it. I'm going to dive in just into the next level of detail, and that SSH example was a good one. It's also pretty simple. Obviously, the stuff like OpenStack is going to be a lot. It's not going to be 5 lines of code. It's going to be more like 50,000 lines of code. But it all sort of builds on these same principles, where we have a resource, which is what we see up on the screen here. And in this case, it's we're managing the SSH configuration file, and there's some properties, some attributes that are characteristics of that resource that we want to make sure are in a particular state. In this case, we want to make sure it's a file and somebody hasn't tried to symlink it into their home directory and get a privilege escalation that way. We want to make sure it's owned by root and it has appropriately strict permissions. And if Puppet has a built-in file server, and that source line on 5 lines down says, hey, let's try and download the correct version of the config from the server and put it in place. Puppet will test to make sure that the one that it's supposed to have is the same as what's in place, and if they're the same, it won't do anything. This concept of idempotence is also key to the way Puppet works. And lastly, on the require line there, that's what allows you to describe the relationships between the different resources on the system. In this case, we want to make sure that the OpenSSH, that the package is installed before trying to manage the config file service. So we require the package be in place before we do anything with the file. It's supposed to look more like a configuration file than a program or a script. The idea is that just by sort of looking at the code, we should be able to determine roughly what it's going to do, and we should be able to hand these manifests, as they're called, to people outside of the immediate IT organization. I worked at a place where we stripped out all of the actual content of our files with passwords and stuff like that, but provided the skeleton of our public code to our auditors when we're undergoing PCI audit. And the auditors, being unusually savvy for auditors, were aware of Puppet and were able to take the manifests and say, hey, if you can show me some assurance that this code is actually running on your systems, then we're done here. I can tell from looking at it what it's supposed to look like. And if you can show me the report that says that that Puppet actually ran and enforced what you told it to, then I have both a preventative control that says that you can't change things, as well as a detect control that says that if it's changed, it will be reverted and we'll get a message about it. I'm not saying that your auditors are necessarily going to be as enlightened as these ones were, but it was a pretty awesome experience, and certainly a lot less of a headache than having to walk them through each one of those systems and show them what we've done. To expand that example a little bit more, I had previously the require line, which pointed at the package of OpenSSH server. This is what the middle definition describes: a really simple resource that has the OpenSSH server in it. And then with the last piece of this sort of triad of kind of a building block of a Puppet module is to say that the service itself also needs to be running, and when anything on the config file changes, that the service should restart itself, and that's what the subscribe message does. So as I said, you can manage more things than just these kind of primitives on the system packages and services. This is a pretty cool example that shows a bunch of IIS-related resources, and Matthew later on today is going to talk more about some Windows-specific resources and things that you can do that are there's a lot of fairly advanced Windows systems administration that you can do straight out of Puppet now. The cool thing is that the code base is stored in the same place. It looks roughly the same, so the whole team can play together regardless of whether they're more Linux or Unix focused or more Windows focused. Getting everybody running from the same code base using the same tooling can be really beneficial. We have a bunch of recently released Windows modules that expand the functionality into stuff like the SQL Server, managing NTFS, ACLs, registry keys, and I believe that this one uses a reboot module as well that allow you to manage, like, after this thing installs, then once it's finished, reboot the machine. So all of that is sort of core Puppet functionality. This slide kind of breaks down how that ties into how the ecosystem works and how that ties into the thing that we sell, which allows us to continue to exist as a business, which I think is a pretty cool thing. Puppet Enterprise is sort of a layer on top of the open source Puppet components. It's focused on solving problems beyond just configuration management. It's about getting teams to work together. Sometimes you'll have a subset of the team which can you only want to have management over a subset of the nodes that are the total population. That's not something that Puppet inherently knows about, but the Puppet Enterprise console has role-based access control that lets you delegate out the management of those machines. And we're building these applications, Puppet apps, that sort of sit on top of that core platform functionality. These are things like stuff to manage the node management lifecycle, reporting, which is under configuration management, this code management workflow, Thomas is going to talk a little bit about that, and application management, which is allowing you to model more complicated relationships between nodes than you can do just running through this a single node Puppet run. And this is sort of a short rundown of the node lifecycle. So when Puppet runs, it runs a little tool called Factor, which gathers information about what's running, what the system looks like. It gathers up the operating system, what version of the kernel is running. It's easy to extend with custom facts. So if you have information that's on your systems that you need to make decisions about when you're compiling a catalog, which is sort of the next step, you can easily extend Factor to include those facts. Puppet will wake up, run Factor, submit those facts, and make a request to the Puppet server for a catalog. And the Puppet server takes the information from the node and the information that it's been told to apply, the configuration has been told to apply to the node, and makes what's called a catalog for them. A catalog is that model that I talked about earlier. It's a description of what the state ought to be based on how you've defined your code base. The server returns that catalog down to the node, which then goes through that cycle that I just described around checking the system state, determining if there's any drift, and fixing any problems if it detects them, and then submits a report back to the server. So this is kind of the central loop of how Puppet runs every time it runs on all the nodes in your infrastructure. By default, it's set up to wake up every 30 minutes and run. Some sites have a much shorter window that like to run it every 5 minutes or so. Some sites have moved to a more on-demand kind of model where it's either not running automatically or due to their change management process, or they run in the no-op mode where it just sort of detects and reports. And then when they're inside a change management window, they can then flip the bit that says now actually enforce, and then they have a good degree of responsive. They understand what those changes are going to be and can see in the reports what actually happened when the changes went out. Is anybody, I should ask too, is anybody running in that model now, or they run Puppet in no-op mode primarily and then only flip over to enforce mode when they need to? We see that a lot in financial sector kind of companies, and I'm not sure if anybody here is working on that in that mode. We won't admit to it. Puppet also handles bare metal provisioning. We have a tool called Razor, which allows you to discover and provision new servers as they come up. It's pretty awesome. It's come a long way. It was a project that got completely rewritten in between the time it started and the time it went into beta, and then went through almost another complete rewrite before it actually saw a production release. So it's had a ton of engineering work into it, and the idea is just to really make it as quick and as automated as possible, from plugging a machine in and turning it on to getting it to where it's got an operating system on it and it's checking in with Puppet. Additionally, as I said, that same idea of writing code, writing Puppet manifest to manage resources can be extended to all kinds of things. We have a new set of modules which manage Amazon resources, and so this EC2 instance resource looks very similar structurally to the SSH service that we looked at a minute ago. So it's not like you have to completely relearn syntax. It's just that there are a few different properties that you have about a running EC2 instance. And this describes, which region and availability zone you want this instance to be running in, what the image ID is, and you can provide tags. So that under the hood, this ties into the Amazon API and will first, just like Puppet does when it's running on an individual system, to detect detect system state, it will test and see if this instance is running against the Amazon API. And if it is, okay, no problem, we'll let it be. If it's not running, then we'll start it up. There's a bunch of other Amazon-related resources. Their APIs are really pretty involved. There's about 50 or 60 different individual types of things that you can manage through Amazon. I think we support about 20 of them now, and are expanding that with each new release. We have plans to build some more module for Windows Azure so that you can do the same thing with Azure instances and describe what you want them to look like, and then use Puppet to enforce whether they're running. I'm not sure why we have some. I guess we have a ton of these. There's like a lot of Amazon. This one has Route 53 zones.
Is there any ETA with Azure model
I don't know, but I can find out. Do you know?
It's later this year.
There we go. Later this summer. Susanna's my boss, so she gave me the thumbs up there to answer that question. Another cool thing about this is that it allows you to unit test your AWS infrastructure. Because you've now described your infrastructure in code, you can then apply some of those development methodologies that I mentioned earlier, like test-driven development, to what instances are out there. You can make sure that they're running, make sure that these instances are in line with the policy that you're defining in your tests. Similarly for Docker, which is a container format, command line tools to run it, as well as the ecosystem around managing those images, uploading them to Docker service. We have a module which allows you to build, run, and manage Docker instances. This is pretty cool. Is anybody here using Docker right now? Is anybody using it for your production infrastructure? That's cool. Oh. This gentleman over here is. Yeah, Docker's pretty excellent. You sort of run into this problem with Docker that we had with VMware images, and it's sort of this similar idea. Like now, all of a sudden, we've got a meta problem. We have been able to manage the content of what's inside each of these containers. Now we need to manage the containers themselves. And you end up with 30 or 40 different ones, and really have to manage that inventory pretty closely. And Puppet can help you do that by describing all of those things in code and making sure that the ones that you want running are actually up and running. There's a lot of stuff here. We're going to take a break for just a second. We have about 15 minutes. Does anybody have a question before I dive into the next part of the presentation? Go ahead.
Is that available in Puppet Enterprise or in Puppet Open Source?
Is Razor available in Puppet Enterprise? Razor is available as open source, and it is also bundled in Puppet Enterprise.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some other pieces of the ecosystem. These are all things that are inside, that are bundled up into Puppet Enterprise. They're individual projects that are either wholly or partially managed by Puppet and make up different components of the whole stack. The first one is the Puppet server. So it used to be that the Puppet Master ran under Apache or ran under the built-in WebRIC server that it had, and there were problems scaling that, and we were sort of tied to a pretty complicated ecosystem that we had very little control over. In late last year, we released this next generation Puppet server, which is built on top of the JVM. It's not written in Java, it's written in Clojure, but it has some pretty awesome properties like not completely blowing up at scale. If you point 1,000 clients at it, even if it can only handle 500 at a time, the remaining 500 of them will get a response. Whereas with Passenger server, if you run large scale Puppet infrastructure, you've probably seen this thundering herd problem that we have with Passenger, where once you get more than its allotted capacity, it kind of poops its pants, to put it bluntly, and has a lot of trouble both handling that backlog of requests as well as recovering if something goes wrong. So Puppet Server aims to fix all of that. Plus, it allows us to compose these services in a much more kind of modular fashion, so that it can contain, for instance, a certificate authority on one Puppet server, and point the rest of them at it with a built-in proxy layer. It's kind of our foundation for more resiliency and higher availability on the server side of the stack. PuppetDB is also a super important component. It's also a closure application. It's been out for about 3 years now, and is really mature. It's kind of the data warehouse of Puppet. So every report that comes in, the facts that I talked about earlier all get stored in PuppetDB, and it uses Postgres as a database backend, but it kind of has its own translation layer in between the web APIs that you communicate with and the Postgres, so it's not just issuing raw SQL back and forth. You can do a lot of cool data analysis, data munging through PuppetDB. And in Puppet Enterprise, we've introduced Node Manager, which is a rule-based classification system. So rather than have to describe all of your machines individually and classify, hey, this machine over here with this node name gets these classes, you can build more like iTunes smart playlists about your nodes and say, hey, this if you get a machine that has like an Amazon instance that's in this particular availability zone and is this size of instance and was built off of this AMI, assign it these classifications, because I know that's going to be one of my web tier web tier servers. Node Manager is sort of the first of those Puppet apps that I talked about, and this is sort of the crux of where that role-based access control that I mentioned earlier really takes place, because we want to make sure that only those teams, if you're in a sort of even in the ultimate DevOps universe, there's going to be either regulatory or compliance pressure, or just good sense where you don't want everybody to be able to change everything all the time. And the role-based access control that ties into Node Manager is really the focal point for that. I have a slide with a key on it. That's indicating that you're everything I just said. So you can safely delegate out responsibility for managing those nodes. Hyra, are there Hyra users in the house using Hyra? So Hyra is a hierarchical data, short for hierarchy, and it's a hierarchical sort of data modeling mechanism that allows you to describe at the highest level what all of your nodes have in common. These are little chunks of classification information, like everybody should be pointed at this DNS server, and then sort of manage those by exception and say, except if you're over in this data center, in which case we need to point you at this name server, except if you're the name server itself, in which case we want to point you to yourself. And Hyra lets you build up those hierarchies that model what your business looks like and manage them in for fairly simple text. The most common backend is YAML files, which are pretty easy to understand, easy to version control, and allow you to manage a large amount of complexity in your environment with not too much work. Somebody asked me earlier about the Forge, one of the Costco folks. The Puppet Forge is our content repository. There's thousands of modules. I think we're up over 3,000 modules now. This says 2,778 in the screenshot, but I think it's a couple of months old. And what we're doing is building up a repository of modules that we know are super high quality and can manage all kinds of complex infrastructure. Some of them go into this Puppet supported program, which is their actual, just like the Puppet code itself. If you have Puppet Enterprise license, you can call up support and say, hey, this module is misbehaving, help me out. There's also an improved program, which is kind of our own internal continuous integration process for module code. So as soon as you upload a new version of your module, the Forge starts running tests over it and says, hey, is this, is the specification complete? Does it specify its dependencies correctly? Is the code quality good? We can tell some of that just from running Puppet lint over the code and say, hey, you follow the style guidelines. Is there anything likely to be clear? Is it likely to blow up as soon as you download it, or is it going to work pretty well for most people? And the higher your module scores, the further up to the top it'll bubble in the search results. And at the highest level, you get this Puppet approved stamp on your module page, which is pretty cool. It helps people weed through. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had this problem of there were a ton of people writing and uploading content to the Forge. But if you went and looked for something to manage Apache or Nginx, you would get 40 or 50 search results because pretty much the first thing everybody does is write a module to manage Apache, and have no clear indication of why you would choose one over the other. So the approved tooling and the infrastructure not only lets us sort of practice what we preach around continuous testing, but also provides those quality metrics out as a way to help users pick what's going to be the highest quality module for your environment. So I'm not going to talk too much about R10K because Thomas is going to cover this in depth, but the Code Manager app is really an extension of this best practice that's developed out of the Puppet community for mapping branches of code in your Git repository onto Puppet environments and promoting changes through those in nice, controllable, easily understood fashion that lets you manage the release of a change from somebody's workstation all the way out to production. And I have two more GUI slides here. I don't want to steal too much of Elizabeth's thunder because she's going to do a really great demo about these Puppet Enterprise features a little bit later. But Event Inspector is kind of the reporting intelligence hub. It talks to PuppetDB, as I mentioned earlier, and gives you a high-level overview, as well as the ability to drill down into detail about what it is that's happening across your infrastructure. Why is it that this node is consistently red and is not completing its runs? Oh, well, that somebody configured it in a way that Puppet is not able to remedy. So I need to actually, it'll show up as a red node here, and you'll be able to go in and fix that. In addition to the JVM stuff I mentioned earlier, we also have this metric service, which exposes a Kibana dashboard that lets you see exactly what's going on under the hood in your Puppet server. So if you notice that somebody pushed a change and all of a sudden things are running really slow, or you started getting failed nodes when previously everything was working fine, you can check out this dashboard and it will show you what the most common function calls are, what calls from the agents are taking the most time. If there was a change recently, you'll be able to see, hey, I got this. We made a change and pushed out this new module, and then all of a sudden we had this giant spike in catalog compilation time, and everything started blowing up. Maybe there was something wrong there that we should go back and investigate more. And the last kind of ecosystem component is mCollective, which is kind of our messaging framework. It allows you to run sort of individual commands across your whole fleet in a really fast, scalable fashion. So if you have, if you need to trigger an immediate Puppet run rather than wait for Puppet to run for 30 minutes, mCollective is the way to do that. I'm going to talk later about Puppet 4, so I just wanted to mention that we just released Puppet 4.0. There's a few changes, and I'm going to go into that in more detail, so I'm just going to gloss over this one for now. It's a pretty big deal. It's kind of awesome. There's a lot of change in it, and it's available in open source now, but we'll be rolling into Puppet Enterprise later on this summer. So, I'm going to take a big breath here. What's the deal? Why does this matter? Again, why would you care about running all this software? Why is it important to your business that you are spending your time running Puppet code instead of writing shell scripts or running around pushing the reboot button on your servers? Well, it turns out that if you have those high-performing IT organizations that we identified in the DevOps report have fairly consistent properties across them. They tend to deploy code more frequently. So you have to have a certain set of infrastructure in place in order to deploy code more frequently. But if you do, the benefits are that you get to push out changes, you can roll forward in small increments rather than do big bang releases that everyone has to stay up all night for. You end up having fewer failures if you make a lot of small changes rather than few large changes, and it ends up contributing to the bottom line. You get more money, which is a good thing. Money's good. So IT becomes a differentiator. It becomes your competitive advantage instead of a cost center, and that's where Puppet can help out your company. Regardless of where you are, the thing that's certain is that we're all sort of beginning here. This is still a fairly new space. There's all kinds of interesting developments that are going on. It's important to stay abreast of them. Coming here is a great start. There's a ton of community activities that I'm going to talk through, and the important thing is that there's no one right answer necessarily. Everyone is still trying to figure out a lot of these things, and we're all in this together. We have a cool online learning system that has gotten a ton of enhancements lately. It's now this Quest-based system. Kara made a D&D reference earlier, and that's what they call it. They're quests. You have to go through and do stuff with Puppet, and once you're done, you like level up, and then they give you harder quests to do. It's pretty awesome. It's all based around a virtual machine that you can download and run on your laptop or on your virtualization hardware, and it's pretty excellent. We've been doing a ton of work on our documentation too. I recently just got a complete redesign of the doc site, and hopefully it's easier than it ever was to find out what you need. The docs themselves are open source, which is a great way to start contributing too. There have been a number of contributors who ended up working on core pieces of Puppet, but who started out saying, "Hey, you have a typo on this doc," and even if it's just like a missing comma. We do like the Oxford comma, so if there are missing Oxford commas, we'll take pull requests to fix those. But more importantly, if there's actual content that's wrong, or hey, that you said that the docs say it works this way, but I ran up and got this error, that's super helpful, and it's kind of a great way to get started into sending pull requests and getting involved in the community. We have formal training courses that are more multi-day, kind of all-day affairs that help you get started. And these are great too if you have a whole organization that's getting started with Puppet, to get everybody in the training at the same time, so you come out of it with a common understanding and sort of common best practices, so you're not, as the sole person with experience with Puppet, trying to hold everyone's hand and help them write good quality code. Everybody will start off on the same page. I mentioned the Puppet Forge earlier. This is a cool program called Puppet Test Pilots. It's kind of our UX research program. So if you have opinions, and who doesn't, but if you have opinions about Puppet that you want to make known, joining the Test Pilots program is a great way to get involved with our actual product development process. We'll send out surveys, do screen sharing sessions, and talk to people about, hey, can you walk me through this particular problem in your infrastructure? And your opinion really matters in those scenarios, because you'll come back and we'll say, hey, we talked to 15 or 20 people, and 18 of them all said that this was terrible. We should probably spend some time working on that. Or maybe they said it was great and we should enhance that. That happens too. I tend to get involved on the this is terrible side, so I go to that. There's a bunch of community sort of question and answer help forums. We're still use Google Groups as our main mailing list forum, and the Puppet users group has about 6,000 people on it, and is a super helpful, friendly community. I mentioned IRC at the beginning. Our IRC Pound Puppet channel has about 1,000 or 1,100 people on there, and shockingly, for a public IRC channel with 1,000 people on it, it's really high quality conversations. There's tons of people that are on from all around the world, so lots of different time zones. If you're up at 3 in the morning and need help with a problem, there's probably somebody in the UK on who can help you out. I mean, personally, I love that community. That's how I got into Puppet in the first place, was through mailing list and IRC, and I'm just happy that we've been able to scale it out and to engage so many people and still keep it a friendly and welcoming and inclusive place. Is anybody here hiring systems administrators and developers, DevOps folks? Are you hiring folks in your organization? Is anybody not hiring? Well, we are also hiring, and if you're interested in working on Puppet directly, we can make that happen. We're down in Portland, but it's not that far. And also in Portland is our Puppet Conf this year is in October in Portland. It hasn't been in Portland since 2011, so it's cool to kind of bring it back home. So join us. I think I'm a little bit over time, but if anyone has a burning question, I'd be happy to take it.
We have time for burning questions.
Yeah. No. On fire. Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
I see one future with fewer servers and less software. That's an EMP.
Yes, a giant EMP would ruin our chances at having more servers in the future. It's true. And an extinction level asteroid event would also kind of make it all irrelevant. The zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
So you can't run. Yeah, totally. You can't run servers if you're just thirsting for human brains. Yep.
So you mentioned Puppet Lint is a way to validate code. Why doesn't Puppet Lint catch comments, missing comments?
Why doesn't Puppet Lint catch missing comments? I don't know. It probably needs a pull request. I honestly don't know. I'm sorry. I'll take a look at that. Probably should.
Like going through, it'll show you that it's, the indentation warnings and all that. You should run code. It doesn't work.
Cool. We can. I'm sorry. What's that? Puppet parts are validated. We'll totally do that. Yeah, let's chat about that. Maybe we can get a pull request in and get it updated. Okay, that's all for me. Thanks very much.